Well, hello again, friends at Spring Lake Village, and I do appreciate you joining me once again as we continue our new lecture series on Armenia. Before we begin, I just want to make a correction. I think last week in my opening remarks, I mentioned that Armenia during the 20th century had been under the Soviet yoke for centuries. What I meant to say is that Armenia in the 20th century was under Soviet domination for about 70 years. So I noticed this mistake when I was reviewing the YouTube presentation, and at that point I couldn't go back and correct my mistake. In any case, again, I appreciate you joining me this week. And we began our lecture series on Armenia last week, and we discussed the strategic importance of Armenia, its geographical location south of the Black Sea and east of the Caspian Sea. In particular, we mentioned the importance Armenia had as a repository of immense natural resources that were very much prized by the great empires that surrounded Armenia. So gold and silver, iron, copper, which was important as an alloy mixed with tin, to create bronze. We wouldn't have had the Bronze Age were it not for copper. Other minerals like magnesium, etc. So little Armenia, which wedged between the great empires, and remember the Armenia we know today is just a much smaller landmass than it was during its great heyday. It actually, at one time, stretched all the way to the Mediterranean in the west and to the Caspian Sea in the east and far south to Persia. So it depends upon the period that we're talking about. Also last week, we discussed the rise of various kingdoms of Armenia. And the first great kingdom was that of the Kingdom of Ararat, of course, named in honor of the great mountain, some 17,000 feet in height, also known as Urartu. So that's Urartu, the Kingdom of Urartu. We also, of course, discussed how Armenia embraced Christianity in 301 AD, becoming the first nation in the world to accept Christianity as its state religion. This is remarkable because it wasn't until 12 years later, 313 AD, that the first Christian ruler, the Byzantine ruler Constantine the Great, would promulgate his famous Edict of Milan, which accorded Christianity a legal status, and Christianity would then become the official religion of the Roman Empire. So this week, we're going to discuss the very tortuous and complicated history of Armenia. And it's a complex history. So once again, what I want to do is focus in on the major historical events that shaped Armenia. And what you should bear in mind is that Armenia is a story of a people who struggled to survive as from the encroachment and from the suzerainty of these mighty empires that effectively used Armenia as a pawn. So we'll discuss how Armenia evolved, how it maintained its cultural and religious identity And once again, Little Armenia had a major impact in the development of the history of Western Europe and the Middle East, a kind of a history that has kind of been untold by most historians. So it's one of the reasons that I decided to do this lecture. In some ways, the Armenian people and the Armenian diaspora is, we can parallel that with the history of the Jewish people and their diaspora as well. So let's begin with the second part of our new lecture series, Pawn of Empires, Armenia under the Persians, Byzantines, and Ottomans. Now you'll notice I slightly altered the title. I think I had inserted, instead of Byzantines, Russians. We'll actually talk about Armenia under Russian rule in our next lecture, lecture number 3. All right, so let's begin then. So again, as I just mentioned, Armenia, which you see here, now this is from about the 4th century AD, but again, you can see it's a geographical location where it's located just south of the Black Sea and east of the Caspian Sea. Down here we have the Persian Empire under the Sasanians, whom we'll discuss. That was a newer empire that emerged and was the great rival of the Byzantine Empire to the west. You see here it says Roman Empire. That's just an alternate term for the Byzantine Empire at its height. Sometimes the Byzantine Empire is called the New Roman Empire, but this doesn't refer to the historical Roman Empire that collapsed in the 5th century, but to the new Roman Empire in the east, the Byzantine Empire. So again, so strategically located was Armenia, and so coveted by, again, the Byzantines and by the Persians in particular. And remember, the great natural feature of historic Armenia was Mount Ararat, which you see here, some over 17,000 feet in height. Now, remember today, modern day Armenia is just immediately to the east. Actually, Ararat is in the far eastern border of Turkey. So it actually is located in eastern Turkey and not in present day Armenia. So as we discussed last week, a pawn of empires going way back to the 2nd millennia BC, and the situation going forward nearly 2 millennia would not change. So already in the 4th century, the Byzantine Empire, with its great capital of Constantinople, founded by Constantine the Great, would rival its neighbor to the east, once again, the Persian Empire, now in the hands of the Sasanian dynasty, which began in 252 AD. So by the end of the 4th century, both the Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Empire would officially establish their spheres of influence over Armenia. The Sasanians very much wanted to convert the Armenians to Zoroastrianism. We saw how even the previous Persian dynasty too tried to force the Armenian people, now Christians, to convert to the ancient state religion of Persia, but the Armenians were extremely resistant. Christianity, they had fully embraced, and they very much identified themselves as Christians. So the Byzantine Empire to the east in its attempt to maintain the status quo of its empire, um, constantly fought off Persian attacks under the Sasanians. The control of Armenia, this historic region of Armenia, really came to a head during the reign of Shapur II. Shapur, common name among Sasanian rulers. He began to rule in 309. He had a very long reign. He attacked Armenia near the end of his reign in 368, and it would be left to his one of his successors named Shapur III, who began his rule in 383, negotiated a settlement with the great Byzantine emperor. You see shown on a gold aureus, a gold Byzantine coin, that of Theodosius I. So they agreed to formally divide this very strategic region, with the Byzantines taking the western portion of Armenia and the Sasanian Persians taking control of eastern Armenia. And what about the old Roman Empire of the West? Remember, it too had partially controlled historic Armenia. They sort of fade away from the history books. So this is the map blown up. So you can see the border that was negotiated between Theodosius I and Shapur III. So this is the line of the border of 387 between Theodosius and Shapur III. This city here called Divin, D-V-I-N, Divin, this became the new capital of the third kingdom of Armenia that we'll discuss in just a moment. But again, this shows you the division of Armenia. Again, this gives you an idea of the strategic importance. Again, this region had so many natural deposits of minerals that were greatly desired by both the Byzantines as well as the Sasanian Persians. And again, he who controlled Armenia controlled the army, the movement of armies back and forth. So the Byzantine Empire could stop the advance of the Sasanian Persians, their encroachment, and so too could the Sasanians, controlling the eastern region, prevent the Byzantines from entering into Mesopotamia and into their territory as well. So let's now look at Persian Armenia. So that eastern territory that was controlled by the Sasanians from about 428 until 651. Now, you might recall from earlier lectures how the classical Persian Empire under the Achaemenid rulers divided the Persian Empire into various provinces that were ruled by their own provincial governors called satraps. And the Sasanians did the same thing, but this time their governors or viceroys, who were also true military warriors. So they were not just simply civic leaders, but also military leaders. They were called the Marzabans or Marzipan. Now, I was curious when I first encountered this word, and you will too. We're all familiar with marzipan, that wonderful confection, almond, kind of an almond paste that is available in Italy in particular and in Sicily. And I thought, well, gee, does that word, are the two related? And it turns out they're actually not. They're separate words. I mean, this is a true Persian word, and the other marzipan, the confection, has an altogether different etymology. In any case, I guess you can think of a viceroy eating on marzipan, and you'll be able to remember the name itself. So you have these marzipans who administered the region of Persian Armenia, and there had been a lot of sort of discontent among the upper echelons of Armenian society, and as well as the Orthodox clergy after Persian control. And as I mentioned, the Persians, the Sasanians, very much try to convert the common Armenians to Zoroastrianism, but most Armenian Christians were highly antagonistic. They cherished their Orthodox religion. However, you do find some among the Armenian nobility who would convert to the Zoroastrian faith. And later, when Armenia is taken over by Muslim Arabs of the Umayyad dynasty, we have some conversion to Islam. But for the most part, it's important to remember how the Armenians, over the course of the centuries, even now, despite attempts to convert them to the Islamic faith in particular, remain so faithful to their orthodoxy. So during the rule of the Sasanian Empire over Eastern Armenia, a violent event took place during the reign of the Sasanian monarch Yazdegerd II. Here you see him to the left, and this took place in 439. And he very much tried to drive a wedge between the upper echelon of Armenian society, who were more favorably disposed to their Persian authority, versus the everyday Armenian Christian. So Yazdegerd tried to create disruption, and he really tried to push Zoroastrianism on the Armenian people. He very much believed that the Armenian Christians were spies of the Byzantine court at Constantinople. And it is true, I mean, Byzantium is famous for its far-flung spy network. You've heard of Byzantine intrigue. And so Yazdegerd was very sort of fearful of his Armenian Christian subjects. This is a very important chapter in the history of the Armenian people, because it saw the rise of one of its epic heroes by the name of Vartan Mamikonian, very Armenian name. Vartan Mamikonian, you see him here, a bronze equestrian statue of him wielding his sword. He became an epic hero in June of 451 at the famous Battle of Avarar, which is still recounted. It was recounted for centuries orally and then written down, of course, embellished, but it's a great narrative in the history of the Armenian people, of their attempt to put down the great army of the Persians. And their hero was Vartan, who sadly would be martyred when he fought the superior Sasanian troop led by its famous Immortals. The Immortals was that crack elite corps of the Persian army, going way back to the time of the Achaemenid kings. Even Alexander the Great fought the famous Immortals, and they still existed centuries later. The Persians not only had the Immortals and this superior army, but they also had war elephants. And so the poor Armenians were no match. And on the field of battle, their great hero, Vartan Memikonian, would die, but hereafter would become a great symbol of resistance against threats to the Armenian people. They would never succumb to other greater powers and would remain loyal both to their faith and to their country. So Vartan Memikonian is the great hero of the Armenian people. Meanwhile, the Byzantine Empire controlled Western Armenia, as we discussed, and this part of Armenia became immensely wealthy. It had great commercial centers of trade that acted as entrepôts or emporia between the Byzantine and the Sasanian Persian Empire. The most prosperous and most famous city of Western Armenia was Artashat. And the great emperor Justinian, very famous emperor of Byzantium, reorganized the statecraft and the provincial rule of Western Armenia, and he overhauled the laws of Armenia, in particular, the laws regarding the inheritance of property. So hitherto, property among the nobility in particular passed on to the sons. If there weren't sons, then the land would pass on to a surviving brother. But Justinian decided to open up and reform the inheritance laws. And so now the daughters of Armenian nobility could also inherit property. Now, some might see this as him being a champion of women's rights. This actually was not the case. What he was attempting to do was to try to weaken the very powerful, tightly knit clans of the Armenians, which could be traced back for centuries. And so he thought that by allowing women now to inherit property, they could then pass it on to their husbands, and those husbands might be outside that immediate clan. Perhaps the young Armenian woman might marry somebody who was not Armenian. So Justinian was very wily, and this was more sort of his part in attempting to sort of weaken the very, very powerful political clan ties that existed so he could exert greater power over this very important territory. So the Armenians of the Byzantine Empire really did flourish. Many of them became immensely wealthy. Many of them were in the service of the court at Constantinople. And many of them became some of the wealthiest members of the Byzantine Empire. They were very adept at trade and business, and that's certainly the case even today. Armenians are well known for their business acumen, etc. And many Armenians, interestingly enough, became Byzantine emperors. That's not widely publicized. Many just assume the overwhelming number of Byzantine emperors during the epic 1,000-year history of Byzantium were mostly Greek. That's mostly true, but some were Bulgarian, but a number of the most successful were of Armenian descent. And perhaps the most famous was Vasily or Basil, or Basil, if you wish, the first, whom you see to the left in this iconography, Vasiliki. You can see his name up here. Became emperor in 867. He is one of the most interesting emperors in the history of the Byzantine emperor. Highly ambitious. He came from very humble beginnings. His Armenian family were, in essence, farmers, poor farmers, but he had an unsavory rise to power. He turned out to be not only gifted, but extremely ruthless in his ascendancy. So he was, in fact, born of Armenian descent in Thrace, that region which is located in sort of the northeastern Baltic region, a very sort of wild, untamed region in this part of the world. And according to tradition, he had been carried off as a young man. This was quite commonplace during the period in which sometimes young men and women were sold into slavery and would end up in Constantinople. But this time he was carried off into captivity by the Bulgars, well, just a baby. He was able to escape when he was in his 20s, and he made his way to Constantinople, where he sought his fortune, and he became a subject, a client of a very, very powerful individual by the name of Caesar Bardas, who was the uncle and the guiding influence of the current emperor, Byzantine emperor at Constantinople by the name of Michael III. So through an introduction, young Basil becomes intimate friends of Michael III. They become the best of friends, and Basil becomes the most loyal confidant of Michael III. But Basil's influence would grow, and his ambition was kindled. In May of 1866, Michael, in fact, proclaimed his friend Basil, now Basil I, as his co-regent, a co-emperor. But a short time afterwards, allegedly, Michael thought, Basil, as co-regent, believed Michael was unfit to rule. He did not have the mental faculty and was very capricious. So Basil, in fact, murdered Michael III and seized the throne in September of 1867. So murderous rise to power, but he turned out to be a very effective, astute ruler during his reign. He was also a great military ruler. He expanded the Navy, modernized the Navy, overhauled the army, rebuilt the great city of Constantinople, and added to the Justinianic law code. So he ended up being quite an effective ruler. Again, this Armenian peasant grew to become the most powerful ruler in the West at the time. Now, there was also religious rift that was taking place that would define the Armenian Orthodox Church. Even today, the reason why, although you have your Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, and Armenian Orthodox, the Armenian Church, the Armenian branch of Orthodoxy will drift away with the Church of Constantinople, the Greek Orthodox Church of Constantinople. And that rift between these two branches of the Orthodox faith began after one of the famous ecumenical councils, this one held in 451 at the city of Chalcedon. And it had to do with the great conflict between within the Orthodox faith regarding the nature of Christ and his relationship with God the Father. So the traditional view within the Greek Orthodox Church of Byzantium, as well as the position held by the church in the West, the papacy of Rome, was of the dual nature of God, the doctrine of duophysitism, a duophysite, duophysitism. So Jesus having two natures at once, co-equal with God, versus the Armenian position of its church of monophysitism. Christ has one nature and not two. So this was a great doctrinal issue that would be played out for about 2 centuries, and that, as well as some political reasons, would eventually lead to a split between the Armenian Orthodox branch and the Russian, Greek, and even the Roman West. This is a fresco showing Basil I confronting an Armenian ruler, a later Armenian ruler, whom we'll discuss in just a moment, by the name of Leo VI. So let me mention now some of the important contributions the Armenians made within the Byzantine Empire and down through the ages, especially in the area of art and culture, as well as their contribution as great warriors in the Byzantine Empire. So Armenian artisans, well known as weavers and creation of beautiful textiles, in particular carpets. Of course, this entire region, so famous for its magnificent carpets, glorious colors, designs down through the ages. Here's just one example you see to the left. They were also great makers of pottery, ceramics, metalwork, and glassware. And their pottery designs have remained even down in our own time. They're still in Palestine, well known as very gifted makers of pottery. One of the most famous pottery makers is Balian, Balian. The Balians opened up uh, pottery factories in Palestine even before the creation of the modern state of Israel, 1948. They still exist today in Jerusalem, and they still use traditional designs that go way, way back to the period of the Byzantines and Sasanians. Here's a piece here. I picked this up in Israel some years ago, and I was in Israel in 2019 as well and picked up a little item. But this here, you see the fish, very traditional. In the back, the obverse here says made in Jerusalem, and you see the monogram of the Balian family. But again, gifted pottery makers, metalwork, etc., down through the ages. And again, it was important for the Armenians to maintain their cultural identity and their religious practices. I mentioned how about 100 years after they accepted Christianity in 301 and about 404 AD, they a new alphabet was created, a distinctive Armenian alphabet that was used in the creation of their beautiful poetry and in their literature, etc. So they very much clung to that distinctive cultural, national, and religious identity. So they became also within the Byzantine court very important scholars who translated manuscripts from Greek into Armenian, etc. Also from Latin into Greek. I mentioned their importance as traders. Some of them became some of the most celebrated artisans and architects in Constantinople. And in 989, Constantinople was hit by a great earthquake. We're all familiar, with the tectonic activity. The whole of Anatolia, that region of Turkey, as well as Greece, have been hit by major earthquakes over the centuries. And the great cathedral, the greatest cathedral of Orthodoxy, Saint Sophia, Hagia Sophia, sometimes pronounced Hagia Sophia, by the Turks, was hit by a massive earthquake in 989, and the dome was damaged but repaired by a great Armenian architect. So in addition to their important cultural contributions, they were also great warriors, and they were in the service of the Byzantine Empire and recruited into the Byzantine army. And there were nearly 150,000 Armenian mercenaries who would play over the course of several decades important role as part of the great Byzantine Empire. They were regarded by the second half of the 5th century as constituting the most important constituent guard of the Byzantine emperor, of the Byzantine army. And they also were the Praetorian Guard of the Byzantine emperors, and they were known as the Scholarii, kind of an interesting term. Might translate it as scholars, but these were the fiercest and bravest, a very crack auxiliary Praetorian Guard. And interestingly, too, in the 9th and 10th century, we find these remarkable Armenian warriors fighting alongside Norsemen, the Normans, originally from the region of northwestern France. Of course, the Normans crossed over into Britain in 1066, but they had also migrated to the Mediterranean region, had captured Sicily, had their great heyday, and Florid. But in this period, again, 10th century, even into the 11th century, they were among the greatest warriors who were recruited by the Byzantines, and the Norsemen would fight alongside the Armenian warriors as the great assault units of the great Byzantine Empire, of the great Byzantine army. So I know I'm giving you a lot of information. I'll try to wrap it up as quickly as possible. So after this period of Byzantine and Sasanian rule, now Muslim Arabs of the Umayyad dynasty, whose capital was in Damascus in Syria. Of course, we've discussed this the first great Islamic dynasty in earlier lectures when we discussed the history of Islam. This was the great dynasty that also established suzerainty in Andalusia in Spain. But in 645, these Arabs from Damascus took control of Armenia and established the Emirate of Armenia. And now Armenia was ruled by caliphs or caliphs from their new capital of Divin, which would become also the subsequent new capital of a newer kingdom of Armenia. Divan is not far from the present-day capital of Armenia, Yerevan. I'll show you where it's located in just a minute. Now, in the same way that the Sasanians tried to convert the Armenians to Zoroastrianism, so too the new Muslim taskmasters tried to convert the Armenians to Islam, but an agreement had to be negotiated that would permit recalcitrant Armenians from converting to Islam and maintaining their Orthodox faith. So we find over the next couple of centuries attempts to shake off the yoke of the Umayyad Caliphate. Eventually, Armenia would regain its independence in 886, so about 240 years after the Muslim Arabs took control in 645. Armenia is once again an independent country. And now the Caliphate out of Damascus, as well as the Byzantine emperors of Constantinople, would recognize a new Armenian kingdom under the so-called Bakratids, and their prince, who was coronated king of Armenia, was named Ashud. Ashud is a very common first name for Armenian men. In fact, my dad, when he first came to the US, was befriended by an older gentleman who helped him, whose name was Ashud. So I'm actually familiar with this first name. In any case, Ashud Bagratuni of the Bakratid family became the first monarch of this new kingdom of Armenia. And this again was a glorious chapter in the history of the Armenian people. And they actually will establish a new capital called Ani. Divan will become kind of another is still sort of a provincial capital and will become capital again. But during the Bakratid dynasty, it's Ani, and I'll show you where Ani is located in a minute. It was a magnificent city, one of the greatest cities in the world at this time. So in the 10th century, in the 900s, it was one of the greatest cities in the world, a city of 1,001 churches, as it was, which is what it boasted. 200,000 people lived in Ani. So this was 10 times the largest city in Europe at that time. Remarkable. Well known for its glorious architecture. So I had just told you that many Armenians were skilled as architects. So the architecture during the Bakratid age is very important, especially in understanding how to place a dome on a large, expansive space. So the Armenians mathematically were able to figure the limits of how big a dome. And in fact, Brunelleschi, the great Italian architect, was familiar with Armenian architects and how gifted they were in understanding engineering and the mathematics behind dome architecture. Brunelleschi, of course, who erected the famous dome of the Florentine Duomo. So again, great cultural achievements, artistic achievements on the part of the Armenians. So as I indicated, Armenia would exert quite a bit of influence both on the Byzantine world as well as on Europe, and we'll see that again in just a minute. So by the end of the 10th century, Byzantium, although at the time, again, it is ruled by emperors of Armenian descent. Remember, I told you that many rulers in Constantinople were of Armenian extraction, decided to sort of weaken Armenia. They wanted to weaken. It was sort of a recalcitrant country. And so they fully annexed it in 1045. And this had the effect then of sort of weakening Byzantium from the incursion of a new group of warriors by the name of the Seljuks. These were nomads of Turkic origin. The Seljuks would precede the Ottomans. They came from Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks. So unfortunately, the way Byzantium controlled now Armenia had the effect of sort of weakening and sort of reducing the effectiveness of Armenia as a buffer state against the encroachment of new warriors coming out of Central Asia. So here you see the great city of Ani. Here, this is actually present-day Armenia, but during this heyday, during the Bakratid dynasty, it was in fact located in this new kingdom of Armenia, the great city of Ani. So now we enter into sort of a really remarkable chapter in the history of Armenia, with the rise of what was called Little Armenia, in Latin, Armenia Minor or Minor, also known as Cilician, Armenia of Cilicia. So this is what was called Little Armenia, which is located in present-day southeastern Turkey. So this region of Anatolia. So here's down to Cyprus. Here's the Levantine coast with Syria, Palestine, Israel. But this is a new federation of Armenians called Little Armenia. And the Bakratid kingdom began to collapse, and many of the wealthiest Armenians escaped to Cilicia to find refuge. And the leader of these refugees was named Reuben, and it was he who would establish the new kingdom of Armenia Minor, Cilician Minor, with its capital at Sis, S-I-S. And this became another great cultural Armenian polity, okay? So far removed from its historic Greater Armenia that we've been discussing, this is a new Armenia, a new Little Armenia, and it flourished as well. And it was a very multi sort of cultural country, Little Armenia, not only consistent of Armenians who were the upper class, the elite, the ruling class, but it had a mix of Greek merchants, Jews, and Muslims. And the Armenians of Little Armenia, Armenia Minor or Cilician Armenia, were great traders, very important intermediary and middlemen between the great merchants of Venice and the merchants of the great city of Genoa, so between the Venetians and the Genoese. Now, what's very interesting is how the upper class Armenians of Cilicia begin very much to adapt the trappings of Western European nobility. Many of the Armenian nobility were members of the Crusades, and they adapted the ways of the chivalric knights. They adapted their clothes. They even began to use European names, in particular French names, German names. We find them intermarrying them. But interestingly, again, they wouldn't go so far as converting to Catholicism or Greek Orthodoxy. They still identified themselves as Armenian Christians. But again, we see the impact of Armenians on the West, culturally in particular and militarily. So the Cilician Armenians had a tremendous impact on the development of Crusader architecture. So in the region of Palestine, in the region of southeastern Turkey, you find the remnants of many Crusader castles. A lot of that architecture is based upon achievements and advances on the part of Armenian architects. So the West would learn many of its building techniques on how to construct fortresses, castles, as well as churches from the great Armenian stonemasons who now dwelt in Armenia, Cilicia, and many of whom had established their homes in some of the Latin states that were created by the Crusaders. So here's a good map. Here you see, this is a good map of Cilician Armenia, Little Armenia. Here's its capital of Sis. I think I pointed out Adana earlier, but Sis is actually up here. And then you have, this was the Byzantine Armenia that we had discussed, and then Greater Armenia that had been under the control of the Sasanians. This is present day Armenia. So here's the present day capital of Yerevan. Here's the capital of Ani under the Bakratids. Here's the capital Divan under the Arabs and under the fourth kingdom of Armenia. This is a really good map. Might want to study it. But again, the purple, little Armenia. So let's end today's lecture with a discussion of Armenia under the new Turkish Empire, the Osmans, who would succeed the Seljuk Turks. So Little Armenia would last for nearly 3 centuries, and it had to face numerous attacks from the Seljuks and from Mongols, you know, the great Mongol hordes that overwhelmed the Middle East and captured the great city of Baghdad in about 1250. Egyptians under the slave soldiers called the Mamelukes in 1375 captured Little Armenia. And we find the last king of Little Armenia, of Cilician Armenia, a man by the name of Leo VI. You saw him earlier in that fresco when he is confronting Basil the First. So that the history, you know, it's anachronistic. But Leo VI is the last legendary king of Little Armenia, named also as Levin. But he's known in the West as Leo VI, Leo Lusinian. He had to flee and he becomes an exile in France, and it's where he died. And if you go to the famous Gothic cathedral of Saint Denis, north of Paris, and that's kind of the great spiritual cathedral in honor of the patron Saint Denis or Saint Denis, you'll find actually the grave of Leo VI. And Leo VI, of course, had the title King of Armenia. And that honorific title would pass on to the King of Cyprus, then to the Doges of Venice, and later the rulers of the House of Savoy. So it would later become an honorific title. We think of how Victoria would be named Empress of India in the 19th century, but this sort of sobriquet, if you will, this honorific title, King of Armenia, would live on in these various subsequent rulers, again, the kings of Cyprus, the Doges of Venice, and the rulers of the House of Savoy. Now, Little Cilicia would be the last independent, autonomous Armenian state. The Armenians would have to wait 650 years, not until 1918 or so, that short period just before the Soviets took place. It was a short period, few years before they would realize their independence. And now we find with the fall of Cilicia, once again, greater historic Armenia, the ancestral homeland of the Armenian people, once again reemerges on the scene. And we find once again, 2 great empires vying for control of historic Armenia. Again, that region south of Black Sea and east of the Caspian. Now, this time between the new Ottoman Empire and the last great Persian Empire under the Safavids. And the Safavids were able to conquer Eastern historic Armenia in 1585. And just 20 years later, the greatest Safavid Shah by the name of Abbas the Great forced the Armenians to migrate from their great city of Jolfa, which is in present-day Azerbaijan. This was one of the wealthy city that the Armenians had built up. You find, the Persians did forcibly try to move Armenians to resettle so they could rebuild cities and spur economic activity. We can draw parallels with the Jews throughout their long centuries of how the Romans tried to relocate them so they could build up economic activity because of their recognition of their prowess as businessmen. So too the Safavid Persians recognize the Armenians' talent as important in economies and important as traders, important as merchants, bankers, etc. So the historical record shows how Abbas the Great forced Armenians to resettle into the great imperial capital of the Safavids, the splendid capital of Esfahan, one of the most beautiful cities in present-day Iran. And there they created New Jolfa, which became one of the great commercial and cultural hubs throughout the 1600s. And the Armenian merchants were able to set up trade networks, were the great intermediaries of trade between India and the Persians, and Persia and Italy and Britain. So very influential in creating sort of international trade. Meanwhile, despite these diasporas and forced resettlements of the Armenians, they're still maintaining their cultural identity and their religious identity. And we find them preserving their music and their painting, their writing in cities like New Jolfa and in other areas where Armenians would settle, like Nagorno-Karabakh, as I mentioned, the site of a major conflict in December. And we'll talk about that once again, the ongoing fighting among the Armenians of this contested area. And that'll be in our last lecture. I went way over. I really apologize. I do hope this lecture was instructive. I tried to really concentrate on the important high points. In this map, you can see present-day Armenia with the capital Yerevan, and again, Nagorno-Karabakh, again, is this contested area, as is this area as well, called Nakhchivan, where you find a rather large Armenian population, too contested, but Nagorno-Karabakh is the most important. So let's meet again next week. We'll discuss Armenia under the Russian Empire and then discuss one of the saddest chapter in the history of the Armenian people. Very important discussion on the Armenian genocide, which began in 1915. So I'll see you again next week. Thanks so much for joining me.